Hi, everyone. Welcome to this presentation on open educational practices, faculty self-defense in a privatized knowledge ecosystem. My name is Matt DiCarlo. I'm an assistant professor of social work at Stockton University in Southern New Jersey. You can reach me at the email address here. I also have a collaborative website with Kim Pendel at www.opensocialwork.org, where you can find me on Twitter more often than not at Prof. Matt DiCarlo. So just so you know, this presentation is about an hour in length. The first half, we're going to talk mostly about why faculty would need to engage in self-defense, what open educational practices are, and what problems and solutions they address. And in the second half of the presentation, we're going to go over specific platforms that you might use to either find open educational resources to use or share the resources that you have created. So this presentation happens in a very particular context. And I think it's important for us to sort of pause and consider where we are. So COVID-19 has taught us a lot of things, but I think it should have taught us the importance of open practices. So the spread of effective therapies across countries, the open sharing of study data, preprints, and post-publication review on the novel coronavirus, the necessity of free access to scholarly articles about coronaviruses, all of those things, from open data to open access to open science, are undergirding our global response to this crisis. Yet, when social work academics have to adapt in a time of crisis, we have not responded by adopting those same open practices. COVID-19 mandated that we all revise our courses for virtual and flexible delivery. We're working harder than ever to produce these virtual learning objects, yet our practices and platforms force us to reinvent the wheel by impeding our ability to share and build resources as a community. And this is what open educational practices are designed to address. They're designed to address the impact of privatization on scholarship. So this quote here from Eileen Joy, I think, does a good job of laying out what the issue is. So for me, open practices are about how might certain forms of academic publishing, especially scholar-led, community-owned, open access platforms and presses, the things we're going to talk about in the second half of this presentation, how might they enable better forms of institutional life for faculty members and increase public knowledge, emphasizing the civic role of universities in spreading knowledge to the public. And this is especially important at a time when the university is swarming with managerial technocrats invested in privatizing and outsourcing higher education. Students are saddled with staggering levels of debt and the casualization of academic labor, the things that are just sort of expected from you, that you do on your own time because you care, not necessarily because you get paid more to do them. All of those things are at an all-time high. So part of the problem here is that we are building on closed foundations and on closed platforms. And this is sort of, I think that this concept can be a little bit strange to get a hold of, but I think this metaphor specifically, digital sharecropping, is a term that really helps describe what I'm talking about. And this was put out by Nicholas Carr in 2006, way back when things like YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and stuff were just taking off. See, there's even Google Plus on there. That doesn't even exist anymore. So Web 2.0, by putting the means of production into the hands of the masses and withholding from those same masses any ownership of the product of your work, provides an incredibly efficient mechanism to harvest the economic value of free labor provided by the very many and concentrate it into the hands of the very few. And I think that Carr's words probably mirror very well still our interactions with these social media platforms, where we contribute a lot of free content that is then taken and monetized by those platforms. But I think it's also an apt framework for understanding just how we produce knowledge within social work and how we share it within the information ecosystem. So just as social media posts are monetized in an environment of surveillance and anti-privacy and walled gardens and paywalls, so are the intellectual products of social work educators. We create articles, books, and activities and lectures and all of these wonderful interactive virtual resources that we've had to do inside of COVID-19. And then we put them on platforms that virtually nobody can ever access, that students themselves who can access them will lose access to them for after they graduate or after the end of the semester. And oftentimes we're building things that we don't even own the rights to, and that are profitable for publishers and universities and not necessarily for faculty. So I would like to sort of, building on Carr's terminology, throw out the idea of intellectual sharecropping. And we define that by building on borrowed content and borrowed information, and building on borrowed space on closed platforms. So I want you guys to think about, in our current model, what you were preparing for a very likely to be virtual spring semester, or what you did this semester for fall. What is your role as a faculty member? For most of us, it's probably as like an entry-level programmer and course designer. So we take textbook content and journal article content and other things that we find, we customize them, we enter them into an LMS platform, align them with our assessment for accreditation, and make sure that students get the required stuff that they need. And we can keep a copy of our work, assuming that we created outside of the LMS, like in Word documents or PowerPoint slides like this one. We can build on them year after year, and we can share those informally with others, but we can't publicly share our derivative or adapted works, because the original content is covered under traditional copyright and is therefore the property of the textbook publisher. So it's very common for textbooks to come with slideshows. And it is very common for faculty to customize those slideshows, because they tend to be fairly boring when they come from the publishers. But you can't share that publicly. You can't put that on your own website, because the content within those things is covered by copyright and not yours. So it's worth thinking about, if you wanted to share everything that you created for your current courses, what do you currently have the authority and possibility to share publicly? For faculty members, some might say that, well, I can share everything, right? I could share my PowerPoints if I really wanted to, but it's worth thinking about, like, as faculty members, and we sort of know this from the literature from librarianship, that faculty's ideas of copyright don't necessarily line up with the realities of copyright law. And the reality is that most faculty routinely violate copyright law. That we include images in our slideshows that are copyrighted, that we do not have the legal ability to reproduce and redistribute. That when we post links to journal articles in the LMS platform, we don't use the proxy link that makes students sign into the library in order to access it. We'll just throw the PDF on there. And if we have a book that we maybe use 2 chapters of or 3 chapters of, we'll post that extra chapter, just so students don't necessarily have to buy that extra book if we're only really using a small part of it. And those boundaries and pushing those boundaries is fine, as long as no one's really looking. And as long as we sort of stick to our isolative approach towards course design, then this is not really a problem, but it limits what we can achieve. Open educational practices are about connection. Every year, hundreds of social work faculty teach the exact same classes, and yet they cannot share the majority of the resources that they create because they are copyrighted by a textbook publisher, or because they are locked into a closed platform like an LMS platform or an OPM platform that is inaccessible to the public. These closed practices and platforms force us to recreate the wheel 1,000 times over and limit the means by which we can share what works when teaching social work. Publishers own their content. You can teach from it, you can read it, you can assign it, you can critique it, but you can't share those derivative and adapted works like slideshows or assignments. OPM contracts and some universities go even further still and claim ownership of faculty created content wholesale. And you should check with the American Association of University Professors to see if your university is one of those schools. And you can also check with your either OPM contract or whoever your department contracts with for fee-for-service educational technology or instructional design to see what the intellectual property policy is. So as we're thinking about the role of faculty, most most faculty are familiar with the idea that textbooks cost too much. But the reason why textbook costs are allowed to skyrocket is because of that classic principal agent problem. Students have no control over what textbooks they use for the class, and they have little opportunity to comparison shop. They are a captive market. They don't know which professors actually use the textbook, which professors, have a required textbook on the syllabus, but don't really use it because, well, the department requires that, but I cover it all with worksheets and slideshows. They also don't know which faculty members just end up reciting the textbook during their class, just in PowerPoint format. And why would you need to buy the $200 textbook for that class? Faculty, meanwhile, are given free copies of textbooks and instructor resources, sometimes unaware of the cost that their choices impose on students. So faculty are generally pretty happy with the textbook that they use, and they evince some pretty complicated ideas around the role of textbook costs with their students. So there's pretty common frustrations that, there's a new edition every 2 to 3 years. It doesn't change very much. It costs more, and you end up having to re-prepare your course just because they've moved some stuff around or added some new content, and all of your slideshows and quizzes need to be updated. But where this is going is a system in which there is heavy amounts of vertical integration, as well as horizontal consolidation within the market, and to eventually get to a place of intellectual monopoly and the enclosure of social work knowledge. Faculty are at least somewhat aware of these issues. So when surveyed, this is the Seaman and Seaman site here, is from a survey of 4,000 faculty members across North America. And the top quote there, the cost of course materials is a serious problem for the students in my department. 89% of faculty chairpersons agreed and 61% of faculty agreed. 69% of faculty believe that their department's textbooks could be made better by making them less expensive, which was by far the most popular suggestion. Yet in their specific courses, 48% were satisfied or very satisfied with the cost of textbooks in their classes. And that 82% of faculty were either extremely or moderately satisfied with the textbooks in their classes. So for faculty, it seems like these are issues that they're aware of that affect students in a significant way, and even affect students in their department, but within their class, textbook costs are just simply a part of student life, though one that they realize impacts students. As you can see in the chart on the left here, college textbooks have absolutely skyrocketed in their cost. So in comparison to medical services, new home prices, and the consumer price index, college textbooks have gone up quite a bit. Now, one of the arguments that I hear pretty often when I talk about open education and textbook costs is that textbook costs aren't important because in comparison to student debt, they're actually quite small. Students might spend a couple $100, maybe $1,000 per academic year on college textbooks, whereas their student debt is likely to be tens of thousands, if not $20,000 or $30,000 of debt by the time they graduate. And that is an inapt comparison. What the data shows us is that a textbook, a $100 textbook, should not be compared to debt, but should be compared with a week's worth of groceries for a single adult. And that $500 in textbooks or a $100 textbook in each of the 5 classes that the student is taking is a month's worth of groceries plus gas money. That textbook costs, when you ask students, are immediate. It is a second tuition bill that is due the first day of the semester, that is often not covered by financial aid, and that they have to take out either alternative loans, take on more work in order to cover that cost. So this quote here from a student, I think, elucidates that pretty well. And as a faculty member, this study that I did with Dr. Carrie Vandergrift at Radford University, we surveyed about 156 students from 6 different schools of social work throughout Virginia. And we found that, yes, students take on more loans, they get more hours at work, but they're also skipping meals, that they're not going home to visit family over breaks, that the majority of our students, even though it is a slim majority, don't buy the book the first week or 2 weeks or even 3 weeks of class, because they're waiting to make sure that that purchase that might take a week's worth of groceries out of their account is actually needed to do well in the class. And what we see in our BSW students, especially, is that they are more likely to engage in piracy. So whether that means going to a pirate repository and downloading a PDF of the book, or just taking pictures of their neighbor's book. So because of textbook costs, we are basically forcing students who cannot afford the textbook to either go without that textbook, which can lead to really negative scholarly outcomes, or to engage in illegal behavior or behavior that furthers historic social inequities inside of higher education. And so students, particularly marginalized students, bear the brunt of this burden. And as we've seen from when open and free alternatives to textbooks have proliferated, so has the evidence that the textbook cost burden worsens existing social inequities, especially under students who are non-white, part-time, or otherwise quote unquote non-traditional. So this model of putting out a new edition every 2 to 3 years that doesn't really change very much and is ever more expensive each time it comes out is not going to be around forever. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is that student spending on textbooks, even as they are getting more expensive, is going down. So students are spending less and less. And there are two reasons for that, one of which is the used textbook market, as well as the market for previous editions of textbooks. So with the emergence of Amazon, Chegg, and some of the other third-party sellers, it's easier than ever to not go through the bookstore and not pay through the nose for your textbooks. More starkly, though, we have a lot of students who are simply not paying for textbooks at all. So to counter these forces, publishers are moving away from this sort of traditional model of like print and paper and shipping it out to schools towards a much more cost-effective model, which is renting access to textbooks and building adaptive courseware that ensures that students have to buy access to that book as well as buy access to the homework platform for that book. And by replacing the fixed cost of paper book publication with those of digital distributions, publishers are not only saving money, but they eliminate any transfer of ownership to the intellectual property. So students can resell a used book once they're done with it. They can't do that with an access code. There's no such thing as a used access code. So by transitioning to rental platforms, you are eliminating the used textbook market. This model is often co-opted using the language of inclusiveness, of access, and probably worse than all of those is equity and social equity. Lost in all of this marketing is who played a role in creating these incredibly onerous conditions for students just to pass the courses that they have to take. And from a faculty perspective, this model threatens academic freedom. This model, which is very prevalent within general education classes, is not only about sort of lowering costs, but creating these auto-graded, self-teaching course-in-a-boxes. And those models threaten faculty's academic freedom because when publishers make agreements with departments or with universities, they are making deals for their textbooks only. So if you were subscribing to Cengage Unlimited, maybe your department has a deal with them where you can get lower access to textbooks. If all of your students are buying into that platform, maybe you don't want to use that Pearson textbook or that McGraw-Hill textbook because you're just going to make them buy another thing that they would otherwise have access to. You're probably just going to use the Cengage book. And even still, do your students have a meaningful way to opt out of inclusive access? These models, inclusive access, equitable access, are actually just automatic billing. That is a much more accurate term for it. It is a way for publishers to bill directly to student accounts and eliminate the middleman of the bookstore or any ability of students to engage in cost-cutting strategies. And I think it's worth pausing on, while academic freedom within academia means that faculty can choose other things. These agreements, whether formally or informally, can either prohibit or limit the ability of faculty members to choose the materials for their courses that they think are most appropriate. The privatization of education also means the monetization of student data. You can see here a comic from XKCD on the EULA, or the End User License Agreement. Now, I'm sure as a faculty members, just like me, you always read the End User License Agreement. But do you read it on behalf of your students? And do your students read it before they can submit it? And even if they do read it and they don't like what's there, Do they have a meaningful option to opt out of that system? For most students, the answer is no. So if your professor requires you to submit your paper to Turnitin or SafeAssign or VeriCite, you are in fact requiring your students to give their intellectual property to this for-profit company, who is then going to use it to train and make better their plagiarism detection algorithm. Students are not compensated for that work, and faculty do not necessarily benefit from those platforms either. They tend to have pretty high error rates. Faculty also require the use of lockdown browsers, which can control what you do on your computer. And more pernicious still are proctoring services like Proctorio, which will track your eye movements, track what is in your lap, make sure that you have your movements behind, that nothing is moving behind you. They'll be able to control your computer. And if you complain about them, they might dox you, like they have done for students who have criticized them publicly. They have posted their chat logs with support in public forums. They have sued faculty members who criticize them with frivolous lawsuits that violate the First Amendment, so-called SLAPP suits. Because the goal for educational technology isn't just to deliver a service, it is to monetize the information that they can get from students. Now, chances are if your IT department contracts with an educational technology vendor, they are on the up and up. They have to pass muster with your IT department, and they need to be compliant with FERPA, which protects students' rights. But the goal from publishers' perspective is to get you onto their platforms, not necessarily your school's platform and the LMS platform, but onto this third-party platform. And at that point, when you're requiring them, like you do to go to Turnitin or any of these other platforms, they can monetize that data. They can then sell it back to other universities or to advertisers or other people who might be interested in it. There's a reason why Canvas, which is the most popular LMS provider in the United States, was recently acquired by a private equity firm who immediately moved to monetize that vast student data. Now, to their credit, they have engaged in good faith with their critics about this issue, but that's only because there was a sustained and coordinated opposition to the monetization of student data. I think it's worth pausing and thinking about the role of faculty in this system and how our role is being eroded. That our role in creating educational resources, in working with one another to figure out what is the best way to teach social work to students, and to create learning experiences that are authentic and meaningful for students and that fulfill the goals of becoming a competent social work practitioner. And how they are under threat by privatization. That the future that we are going to, and that I would argue is at least here for the general education curriculum and is going to be here for the social work curriculum, is the monopolistic ownership of content and products and platforms. And you can see this pretty well with online program managers, which not only monopolize those, but also run things like recruiting new students and admissions as well. You'll also see the increased use of rental platforms and automatic billing, whether those things are agreements that are done between the university and a publisher or a specific faculty member who's interested in reducing the price of textbooks and will make an agreement with a publisher to do so. You'll also see more monetization of student data, as well as the centralized course development and design. These are course in a box approaches towards social work education. And if we think about it, what is the role of faculty members with a course in a box that's designed by a publisher? I mean, that can be done by a contingent faculty member. That can be done by an adjunct faculty member. Of course, you could take the counterfactual and argue that tenured faculty are efficient from the point of view of market logic and would only stand to benefit from a system based on market logic. That's certainly an argument, but I don't necessarily think it is reasonable. So I spent a lot of time talking about what the problem is. So what is the solution? How can we re-envision what resource creation and education looks like? And I think it's by sort of regrounding ourselves in what knowledge and what information really is. So this quote from Eleanor Ostrom says that the most notable characteristic of an idea is that it is a pure public good. One person's use of it does not subtract from another's. So if you create this really amazing video lecture on a social work topic, and I use it in my class because you put it up on YouTube, that does not diminish your use of it in your classroom. And it's often easy to forget that like this is ultimately the default. All of the things that we create will eventually be returned to the public domain. For example, if you wanted to create a Dracula thing, you could just do that. Dracula is 100% in the public domain. You can make whatever you want from the intellectual property in Dracula. And I think it's worth pausing and thinking about what would it be like if faculty resource creation, if resource creation for education were like this, if we had these open foundations so that we could build open products that we could share outside of the LMS, that we can share publicly, that we could build off of. I think it would be really nice if more things were in the public domain. Currently that is stuff in the 1930s that is coming into the public domain now. But I've talked about this as sort of a binary. Things are either very closed copyright and hemmed in by the affirmative defense to copyright infringement known as fair use. Or on the other hand, you have public domain where you can do whatever you want. It's basically anarchy. Now, what Creative Commons is, what open describes, is the spectrum in between those. Obviously, the most open is public domain material. The least open is traditionally copyrighted material. But what about all the stuff in the middle? Let's say you wanted people to be able to share your work. But if they do share it, like if they copy and paste like a book chapter that you wrote into their class, you would want attribution. You would want to be cited. And people, can go view your work based on a link that they provide. Maybe you want to make sure that the stuff that you create always has an open license, that somebody who takes your work and maybe makes a really cool video out of it, that they share that stuff for free, and that stuff is not behind a paywall. Maybe you want to make sure that the people who use your stuff don't make money off of it. And so you might attach a non-commercial license. Or maybe you don't want people to be able to edit your material at all. Maybe then you just want a no derivatives license. So open is a spectrum. It's not just a binary choice between open and closed. What Creative Commons licenses, as well as indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge licenses and some of the other alternatives allow you to do is give users of the things that you create more rights than exist under traditional copyright, while still withholding a lot of other things that you can do with material that is in the public domain. So the default for copyright is commercial copyright, all rights reserved. The stuff when you put on a movie, you see that copyright notice, don't make a copy of this stuff. Everything is that. The notes that you're writing on this session, the thing that you created, the assignment prompt that you created for your class, all of that stuff is locked down for life plus 70 years, which is kind of nuts. I don't necessarily think that that is the most useful way to do things. And so open is an active choice. It requires you to use this iconography and legally enforceable system of Creative Commons licenses or other licenses to allow users to engage in transformative use. And what this allows you to do is avoid having to deal with intellectual monopolies, like the 2 or 3 textbook publishers. So Cengage and McGraw-Hill, it seems like that merger is on the rocks currently or currently on hold. But when that goes through, those 2 companies, and right now 3 companies, control about 80% of the textbook market. And there are about 5 journal publishers who control 50% of the market, and that gets up to 70% inside of the social sciences. So openness is a value. It has to do with the fundamental human right to education and the fundamental human right to research and information. Open education began in earnest with open universities in the United Kingdom and even a little bit before that in South Africa, and really gained momentum in the first part of this century with open educational resources and open technology. You can see this alongside sister disciplines like open access and open science and open data. And this is part of a wider effort to democratize education and access to information. Some of the principles that undergird open are things like access and agency, ownership, participation, and experience. And it is because of those things that open education has the potential to become a great global equalizer, providing opportunity for people throughout the world to exercise their basic human rights. What we find is that access to information is necessary in order to secure existing rights and to make a case for why new rights should be acknowledged and served. So open education is also a movement. So by the time you guys are watching this, this conference will have already happened. It's the Open Education Conference. It happens every single year. And it is a very wide movement from a whole host of open education implementations. So you'll see representatives from the open universities throughout the world. You'll see UNESCO and OER for a Better World, where they're creating open educational resources for global development and global education. You've probably at least heard of MOOCs by this point. That fad has a bit died off, but massively open online courses are a major implementation of OER. A domain of one's own, so just having your own website and some of the pedagogical values behind that. Open courseware, which was pioneered at MIT, where they share openly all of the resources that you need in order to succeed in their courses, as well as OER and open textbooks. So what can you do with OER? You can use it. There's nobody stopping you from using it. There's no request for access. There's no paying any money. All of it is available for free. You can also make copies of OER. You can make many, many copies and redistribute them to whoever you want and keep a copy for yourself, which is different than some of these rental platforms where, if you rent access to a textbook, you have it for maybe 3 months. You can't copy and paste from that, and you lose access to it when the period is over. You have the freedom to take away and reuse content in transformative ways without asking permission for the person who originally created that content. You also have the freedom to make derivative works. So again, that adaptation, those slideshows that you would create from a textbook or a journal article, you have affirmative permission from the people who have created it to do those things and to redistribute those things that you create from their original scholarship. However, some of those non-commercial licenses can limit the ability of other users from making money off of the content that you share openly. So what would it be like if our scholarly publication practices and the institutions that we use represented social work values? What if they furthered social justice by making sure that anybody could read them regardless of ability to pay? And that people could use that knowledge in transformative ways to create social change. That is the vision of open access, open education, open science, and the social movement organizations and advocates that support them. By building from open foundations, content and information that is openly licensed in the public domain, under Creative Commons licenses or other open licenses, you can create open products. You can collaborate with other faculty, share what you do as a community of practice. So hopefully by this point, I have made the case for why you should care about open education, and that you may even be interested in sharing some of the stuff that you've created for your courses openly with other people. Some key questions that you're going to want to ask as you were starting out is, how big is the thing that you want to share? So is it an entire course? Is it a textbook, or maybe like a workbook or course book? Is it a learning module? Or maybe it's like a resource, like a learning object, like a video or a worksheet or something like that. So once we have that, and that sort of is going to structure the second half of this presentation, you want to make sure that you have the authority to share with everybody what you plan to share. The easiest way to do that is if you wrote it. If you wrote it, you just need to make sure that your university doesn't claim ownership of the things that you create with their resources or on their time, that you are not taking content that was maybe in your slideshows previously from the other textbook and just sort of still in there. Even though there's a lot of original content around it, you want to make sure that you're staying within the boundaries of fair use if you were doing that. But most importantly, making sure that you are building from open foundations. So if you are sharing somebody else's work, or if you are building from somebody else's work in a transformative way, you're going to want to make sure that that content originally has an open license so that you can share what you've created. Other things to think about is, where is your audience? For me, that means the BPD listserv, probably, because that's where most social work educators hang out. Having a domain of my own, which we'll touch on at the end of the presentation, delivering conference presentations like this, as well as some of the OER repositories that we'll go over. The last thing I wanted to pause on here is, are you comfortable, being public and being an open academic? So what I mean by that is, as social workers, we are sort of familiar with public impact scholarship, like writing op-eds or doing community-based work, But there are some challenges, especially for students who are survivors of trauma and domestic violence, where you may not necessarily want your name and where you live and where you attend school to be public information. So we're sort of familiar with how blurring the boundaries between scholarship and public impact scholarship can be impactful for different kinds of students. The same thing applies here for open faculty members as well. So if you are out there promoting your own work, becoming sharing your stuff publicly, are you okay with people knowing how to contact you and where you work? All of those things are things that you need to consider before you start this process. But let's say you do want to do all of that. You want to share your entire course. How do you do that? So the first option I'm going to go over here is OSF, or the Open Science Framework. So some of the great stuff about OSF is that it's an open source platform. It was originally designed to facilitate collaborative open science projects across institutions. So its main sort of claim to fame, at least when it started, was that it seamlessly integrated different cloud storage providers. So if I'm at an institution that uses Google Drive, somebody else is at an institution that uses Box and OneDrive, all of that stuff works on OSF, and it sort of marries them all together. But what it's sort of blossomed into is that any open content could be hosted on here. More importantly than that, some of these features for open science, things like versioning, making sure that you can see sort of how edits have progressed on a document or course, DOIs, clear authorship that's associated with people's ORC IDs. All of those things are really helpful for open education as well. It's really easy to fork and adapt and remix courses, and you can build a wiki for information on the project and host other documents that, just like you would inside of an LMS platform. And again, just like an LMS platform, you can have public folders and private folders and just determine who gets to see what based on their association with your project. Some of the downsides of working in OSF, though, as we'll see, the interface is pretty basic and it's not super visually appealing. There is no LMS features, no integration, there's no gradebook. It is really just a place to put your stuff and a way for students to browse it. So I'm going to be looking over here on my second monitor. This is HGen 611, which is a data science class. Dana Lapato, one of the authors of this, shared it with me from my alma mater, VCU. So if you were to create a course like this, you would attach a Creative Commons license. So you can see the syllabus here, the lecture schedule, setup, different updates. And here's where you would sort of host your homework, different projects, scripts that they could run in R, those wonderful things. This last feature up here, you can see that this is a public class. If I click this link right here, I could fork this class, copy and paste everything into a new project, customize it however I wanted. So let's say I teach a data science class, but I teach it a little bit differently. I want to upload my syllabus. I would just click that fork button, and then I would have my own version of this class that I can edit and create my own version of. So the other option here, and one I'm not going to go over quite as much, is Moodle Cloud. So Moodle Cloud, Moodle itself is an open source platform. It is an LMS platform, and what Moodle Cloud is just basically an ability for you to host your own material on Moodle if your university does not offer it. So it's free if you host your own server for Moodle. I don't really know how to do that, and I don't really have the inclination to do that, but you could also pay $58 and they will host it for you. It has the full features of an LMS because it is an LMS. Some of the downsides here is that there's cost or hosting duties, and if your university doesn't use Moodle, it probably wants you to use the LMS platform that they pay for, and students may not necessarily be used to using other platforms. Some of the other things I wanted to throw out here, there are things like Canvas Commons and a Blackboard alternative where you can share your courses within the LMS themselves. Some of the challenges, though, universities don't often enable you to share across campuses, so it's sort of limited to just the people in your narrow networks anyway. So those are your options for open courses. But what about sort of the level underneath that? So you want to maybe adopt an open textbook or adapt one and create one yourself. I'm going to go over a couple of options for you. The first one is, where can you find open textbooks? So go to the library, go to the Open Textbook Library. There are 806 textbooks in there. The majority of them at this point have open peer reviews, so that's post-publication peer review. Those are openly identifiable by the professor that wrote them. They all use the same rubric, which is pretty detailed, and provide feedback on those textbooks. So for example, the textbook that I wrote that's in there, it has some critiques from different professors who have read the book, as well as some of the areas that they thought that the resource did pretty well. Some of the good stuff from the BC campus library, even though it is much smaller than the open textbook library, they do a little bit more curation. So they will tell you if there are ancillaries, so things like slideshows and test banks and things like that, which may not come with a lot of open textbooks because they tend to be like faculty labor of love type projects. They will also tell you whether these books are accessible. So if it's just an old PDF that's there, that's free, that's great, but it is not probably screen readable. Whereas if something is built in some of the platforms that we're going to go over next, those things are much likely to be accessible for somebody who needs to use a screen reader or who has issues with contrast on a monitor and reading on electronic files. So I am a big fan of Pressbooks. I use Pressbooks quite a bit. So it's an open source platform. If you wanted to, you could run your own Pressbooks server, just like you could run your own Moodle server. I have no interest in doing that. But the cool thing is that Pressbooks is built by the same people behind the Rebus community, which is a fantastic community of open educators and professionals in publication who are thinking about how can we provide faculty with the tools they need to create openly licensed resources. Pressbooks itself as a platform has integrated things like hypothesis and collaborative annotation of readings, as well as H5P, which are interactive HTML5 elements that you can use for formative assessments and for illustrating concepts or annotating YouTube videos and things like that. So one of the main concerns about open education platforms or any sort of ed tech thing is like what happens when these things go away? Because what happens if Pressbooks goes bankrupt in 10 years? The nice thing about Pressbooks is that it exports to WordPress websites. WordPress runs about 37% of all websites on the internet at this point. So it's probably going to stick around for a while. So Pressbooks itself does a really fancy looking HTML edition textbook. It also exports to PDF, EPUB, other e-readers, so like Nook and Kindle formats, as well as a print PDF that you could use with your university bookstore or printing office in order to print copies for students. It's also pretty easy to remix from other Pressbooks textbooks. If the content that you're using is not from another Pressbooks textbook, you would need to sort of manually copy and paste it, just like you would into any sort of Word document. Pressbooks also has an LTI tool where it can link directly into your LMS platform, and there's no account needed for students. It's just a website that students can visit. It is not monetizing student data. Some of the downsides here, you're probably not going to want the free edition. It exists, but it has a rather obtrusive watermark. The print and PDF outputs, while serviceable and totally fine for the purposes of academia, they're a bit clunky. So there's like a bunch of white space. The size of images that works on an HTML web page may not necessarily line up with the size of images that we would like in a print textbook. And having one platform that does both means that you have some trade-offs there. There are also some premium features like native H5P integration, having a first page that lists a lot of download options. Those things are only accessible to university subscribers, so pressbooks.edu subscribers, which is a much more expensive option that either your university or university system would buy into. But I at least just wanted to give you a look at what a Pressbooks textbook looks like. So this is Scientific Inquiry and Social Work. I created this about 2 years ago. It was published, and it took about 2 years of work to do. It itself is a remix of a couple of other research methods textbooks from sociology and nursing. So it looks just like a normal book. It has learning objectives, images, text. And just to look at the back end a little bit, if you have ever created a WordPress website, it looks exactly the same because it's built on WordPress. It's one of the nice things about having an open source platform like WordPress is that you can then build new things like Pressbooks on top of it. So let's say I wanted to edit section 1.1. You just have like a normal WYSIWYG editor where you can type stuff in. You have text boxes that are already there for you. You don't have to design. It's sort of designed to be a plug and play version of creating your own textbook. So I wanted to give a big shout out to Dr. Rebecca Malden over at UTA. So she adapted the scientific inquiry book for her research courses at UTA, and they teach the courses a little bit differently. So they have an introductory course which focuses on lit reviews and research questions, and then they have a separate course that goes over foundations of social work research. So she adapted the book. So she took the Pressbooks XML that I had in my front matter, downloaded it, and imported it into 2 new Pressbooks projects at her school. She then customized them to the learning objectives at UTA and the different way that they have structured their classes. And in an idea that I am totally stealing, the faculty at those schools or at that school customized the textbook so that when there was an example for how to do some sort of research thing, that they used examples from the faculty's research practice. So as you were reading the research textbook, you were getting to know what the faculty in that department research as part of their scholarship. Obviously, this is something that is available for free to students. And from a faculty perspective, it means you can update the textbook at any time. And in fact, it means you can update it with students. So if you wanted to assign students to either suggest new things to add to the textbook, if you wanted to have them create their own learning objects and create other things that might help other students learn the topic better, you can do that and add them to the textbook itself as part of Pressbooks. Another alternative is to use Libretexts. So Libretexts is a free platform. They are the inaugural grantee of the $5 million Federal Department of Education open textbook grants. And one of their many goals is to make it very, very easy for faculty to remix open content. What they do is they sort of take all of the open content that's out there that they know of and ingest it into their platform. So they'll take a Pressbooks textbook as well as some of the alternatives like Overleaf and Wikibooks and SoftChalk and put them all into Libretexts so that professors can sort of pick and choose what they want to use inside of their class and create a customized textbook that is available for free to students and inside of a user-friendly platform that promotes accessibility. They also have a very, very cheap print store. And just like other open platforms, there's no account needed for students, and this is not a platform that is going to monetize their student data. Some of the downsides with Libretext, so I'm going to demo what Libretext looks like, but you need to use the link that I provided here in order to create an account that will allow you to remix. The remixer is still in beta. So right now it's sort of a proof of concept. It is something that people who are authorized Libretext users can use and publish their own stuff, but you need to make sure that you create an account and talk to them before you do that. Some of the more advanced features from Libretext, things like single sign-on, open homework systems, and other features, they're still in progress. They haven't necessarily gotten to the point where that stuff is out of beta quite yet. So I'm going to talk about Libretext in a minute, but I do want to preface it by saying there are 2 amazing open textbooks that just came out for human behavior in the social environment. And they were both published at the University of Arkansas. And this was one of the best parts of my summer, was learning that another part of the core curriculum of social work has open alternatives to them. And I wanted to talk a little bit about what remix means. It isn't just sort of copying and pasting. It is also giving credit to the original authors. So these are the attributions for the Human Behavior in the Social Environment 2 textbook. You can see that she adapted from this psychology textbook, this textbook on race, another psychology textbook, another sociology textbook, and the same thing with HIBC 1, lifespan development, sociology. And what you'll find is a lot of times, since there's not a lot of open content in social work quite yet, we are borrowing quite a bit from psychology, which has their own open textbook press called the NOBA project. And what Libretext is trying to get you to do is to be able to take a little bit from each open educational resource. So in their OER remixer, which I have here, you can look at their bookshelves. Let's scroll down to social work. Currently they have 5 textbooks in there, and luckily these 2 HIBC textbooks are in there. So let's say I teach HIBC in a bit of a different way. So I teach groups and organizations. And I teach it from the perspective of late adulthood. So maybe this is a gerontology course or inside of a gerontology minor or track or something like that. So I can literally take these chapters inside of Libretexts that look like this, that have regular textbook content, and remix them together and create my own version of this. I'm doing a very slapdash version of this right now. And I click Save to Server. And then once it is saved to server, it is in my sandbox where no one else can see it. I can edit the stuff that I've created before I publish it to the open web so that other people can use it and build from it. So what the OER remixer inside of Libretexts allows you to do is sort of pick and choose, just like a Sunday bar, from the various open textbooks that are out there. But if you're a social worker, chances are, unless you're adopting a textbook whole cloth or maybe making a couple of changes at the margin, you're going to need to come in with things like lecture notes, maybe some worksheets and other things that you have in order to make a fully fledged textbook. So maybe you're not necessarily ready to start all of those things. Maybe you just want to share a resource or two, or figure out where you can at least look at how other people have shared their resources. The first place to do that is on a cloud storage. So the cool stuff about cloud storage is that you already know how to use it. You just create a public or open folder and plan your class in mind with sharing in mind. So, you know, when you're creating slideshows, you're making sure that you're not including copyrighted images, that you're making sure that you provide proper attributions for any Creative Commons licenses you use, things like that. Making sure that you don't have like stuff from the last textbook inside of the slideshows that you do use. It is also useful for classes that aren't open, but maybe are zero textbook cost. So if your class doesn't require a textbook, maybe you require some online readings and some journal articles, being able to share your course calendar and syllabus and various assignments that you use is a way for you to make your course open without necessarily, recreating the wheel and recreating those readings as part of an open textbook. What's more, in cloud storage platforms, they're generally easy to download and edit and remix because they are created in like common programs like Word and PowerPoint. The only exception to that is PDF, which makes it very, very difficult to edit. Some of the downsides of using cloud storage to share your resources are it's not publicly visible. You would need to promote it in some kind of way. It's not like people can search the internet and sort of get to your cloud storage device. There's no open license integration, so you would have to put that manually on all of the resources that you create. And there's no real indicator of quality other than, if you know the person who the person is, who's the folder belongs to, you can sort of know who they are. So this is an example for the Graduate Research Methods book, which is an open textbook project that I'll talk a little bit more about at the end, that focuses on the homework assignments, the various quizzes for all of the different chapters, slideshows, as well as a student workbook. So as they're going through the chapter, and this is linked in the open textbook as well, they can fill out and apply immediately the content that they do to their own individual research proposal. It was something that was really important to us as faculty members, was to not only just replace the textbook, but also replace the workbook and augment it using some of the stuff that we've learned as instructors. So one place where you can do that open sharing, where other people can discover your work, is prof to prof. So one of the reasons I would recommend it is that a social work founded it. Dr. Kristen Slack is the founder of Prof to Prof. Some of the resources on there, they're indexed by subject and institution. Faculty can create profiles and portfolios, so you can sort of get an idea of whether this is a good resource and how it's been used by other people. As well, also they provide hosting, which other platforms, which we're going to talk about, do not. Some of the challenges are there's no open license integration natively. Again, it's something that you would need to put on the documents and the things that you create. The usage rights on here are a little bit more norm-based than they are legally based. The nice thing about Creative Commons licenses is that they are legally enforceable. So if somebody uses your work, that's a non-commercial work that you've created in a commercial way, they would still be violating your copyright on that. Whereas some of these more norm-based things, like if you can use this but don't repurpose it in other ways, those things are a little bit fuzzier on how to enforce. There's also no curation or review, and these platforms do not integrate with LMS platforms. The larger OER repositories, so things like OER Commons or Merlot, they are trusted communities inside of open education. They're going to be around for a while. They've been doing great work for years. They have these review and curation features. So in OER Commons, they're a little bit more group-based. Merlot has a set of editors within a given discipline that will provide editor reviews on top of just regular old peer reviews. They also have authoring platforms. So if you wanted to create resources directly in there, you can do that. That's great because they don't host files themselves. So you would need to, if you created an awesome activity that you wanted to share, you would need to put that on your cloud storage or your university repository and then share it with OER Commons or Merlot. So some of the challenges are if you do use those authoring platforms, though, what happens when these things are no longer in existence? Do you have the ability to then take your resources out and put them in a new platform without having to copy and paste your stuff into whatever that platform is? Although these have the features for reviews and curation, it's still lacking in social work. There are people out there doing reviews, but it's not done in any sort of coordinated way, and there's not really a lot. No one's really shown up to the party yet, but it is a great place to go. The last option, and what I would really encourage you guys to do, is to create your own website. WordPress is a good example, but there are a bunch of other competitors. So Squarespace, Wix, all of them work pretty well. WordPress, I throw out there because it's open source. It runs over a third of the internet. They have free plans. They have inexpensive plans. It's relatively easy to use. It's sort of a WYSIWYG editor, the stuff that you saw inside of Pressbooks. And there are also integrated domain services. So if you need to purchase a domain, you can do that directly with WordPress as well. With the free models and lower cost models, you get limited storage space and watermarks and things like that. But the biggest downside is like you have to maintain and build this thing. And for faculty members who are looking at tenure and promotion, building a website isn't necessarily something that is rewarded. But I think it is really useful to do. So I wanted to shout out Dr. Laurel Hitchcock here, because I think some of her work here really pioneers what best practices look like with a domain of one's own. So she runs a blog called Teaching and Learning in Social Work, where she invites guest bloggers and shares a lot of the content that she creates using an open license. She also is the author with CSWE Press of a traditionally licensed commercial book called Teaching Social Work with Digital Technology. And as part of that process, they shared a number of resources that were originally shared on Laurel's blog. And I share that just to say that just because you share stuff in the open doesn't mean that you can't work with publishers later. It just means that you own that stuff. And it is the publishers who are using your open license to then republish it as their work. I also wanted to end by sort of talking about what might this look like? What does open course prep look like? And it takes a long time. So I took about 2 years and about $23,000 in state grant money. I worked with a bunch of people from my PhD cohort who worked as core authors and editors. We had a bunch of supplemental authors and publishing experts who helped us. And we had some faculty and student advisors who provided formative and summative feedback. We recruited 22 peer reviewers, all of whom helped us create this fully open curriculum for MSW research, including a textbook, slideshow, quizzes, and the other stuff on the cloud storage platform that I just showed you. So this is a way where we are redistributing what course preparation looks like. We now have a community-based and community-owned textbook that anybody can customize, anybody can build from, and anybody can access for free. So hopefully by this point, I've convinced you that you should adopt open practices. And it's worth reviewing some of the reasons why you should, because it helps us build these sustainable and community-owned platforms and content that allows students to access the resources that they need to be successful in classes for free. For faculty members, it means the ability to collaborate with faculty that you will never meet, that you don't need to contact to build from their work. Because we are creating all of these digital resources that are locked away behind the LMS wall, behind traditional copyright, because we don't own the intellectual property, and the platforms on which we publish them are not community owned and accessible. And instead, we can create these renewable resources that can allow faculty to create a knowledge commons. one in which we think about intellectual property not as an individualistic endeavor, but as a communitarian endeavor. And so as a faculty member, this also has to do with your ability to put out there that this is the stuff that you created. So by having things like DOI, peer review, you have these quality indicators for the resources that you create in your class, something beyond student evaluations or a peer evaluation of your teaching. And if you know, in the coming budget cuts from COVID-19, if you lose your job, you can take this stuff with you. It is not locked into the LMS platform that you used to use. This is stuff that is yours that you then choose to use in your classes. So where can you go to get started? There are fantastic award-winning faculty development resources. The OER Starter Kit and Workbook are fantastic self-paced online courses on everything you need to know about OER. They're fairly short, very intuitive. I wrote a teaching note on open textbooks specifically on adapting, and creating. You can also see this video walkthrough of various OER platforms done by Anita Waltz at Virginia Tech. And you can also look at our website, opensocialwork.org, which I run with Kim Pendel. You can also ask a librarian. They would be very, very happy to talk to you about open education and how you can use and adapt from open resources. And finally, you can contact me. I am really happy to help you with any open education projects that you have. And if you need anything, please let me know. I am extraordinarily grateful for your time. I know this has been a long workshop, but I hope it's been worth it for you. Thank you so much.